Good afternoon. Good morning if you're still in uh, the Western Caribbean. Okay, so we'll get started best we can, although we're a little short-handed today. Um, so the plan was for you guys to pick sides on a on the topic that I emailed out last week, which, for reference, is that adverse possession doctrine affords societies a way to prevent violence over conflicting claims to land. Um, with only three of you here, that's mm, that's a little we're a little abbreviated, I think, um, or a little shorthanded on that. So, um, what I would like to do is I would like to give you guys a breakout room to talk amongst yourselves and sort of bounce ideas off one another for a few minutes. And then I want to come back and have a little bit more of a free ranging conversation, even though and just sort of see what you guys came up with and see what you thought. Um, so that's how we're going to structure this. Um, but I do want you to be thinking about and focused on trying to devise arguments for both sides of this issue, right? What's the counter argument to the resolution? Okay, so um, Brittany rolled in a little late, and that's not her fault, right? Timing issues happen. I'm going to ask you guys to get her up to speed in the breakout room, and that's how we'll handle it. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys uh, go now, and there's just going to be one breakout room. Um, and yeah, go on ahead. Okay, so what do we think about adverse possession and violence?
Good morning.
Good morning.
So the group and I we agreed that it helps society, but we didn't really speak about violence. So my own personal intake, I think like in terms of violence, yes and no, because while it helps society, well the courts and communities to like decide what they would do with the property and the owner could be ignorant and still choose to retaliate and do something to the person who owns it, who well in possession of the property at that time. So in terms of violence, I am not sure coming from Trinidad, if somebody wants their land, they will. They will like do whatever it takes. They don't really care if the court say, okay, this is the new person who lives in here, they have all the rights. So in terms of violence, I don't know about the violence, but I think it wouldn't really stop violence that much.
So is the fact that um, there's no one policy that can solve all violent conflicts over land reason to simply agree to allow violence to run unchecked, or should we uh, use policy tools to reduce violence where possible?
I mean, if they can use policy to reduce violence, I think they should. Yeah, I think they should. So the second one definitely.
So without adverse possession as a doctrine, right? If we're dealing with a system like the one in Timor Leste described in Charlotte Williams's article, what um, what are some circumstances where we could see violence arising in over property claims?
Well, I didn't get a chance to read the article, but Ricardo, one of my group mates, he did, and he was mentioning that I think it had war and they basically had to leave or something like that. So Ricardo might be able to answer this part. Ricardo, you wanna help?
Ricardo?
I just got back in. My you took a salt breaker when my computer shut down, so I just got back in.
These things happen. The question was, when you are dealing with systems that don't have adverse possession doctrines, like the one in Timor Leste, what are some sorts of situations that could give rise to a violent conflict over property?
I wouldn't necessarily say violent per se, but where the persons have 5 different sources of title, I think if all of them have that 5 different source, I think everybody will be arguing over who has the particular, well, the right title over it, especially if there isn't clear or even legislation to begin with. So I wouldn't say necessarily it would be violent, but I could see arguments happening because you wouldn't know necessarily between the 5 sources who has this correct title.
Absolutely, right? You know, and the case of Timor Leste is a particular case with its own particular challenges, right? That uh, related to the fact that you had 5 different, as Ricardo points out, you had 5 different governing authorities, each of which issued their own titles, each of which are valid under their own legal systems. Um, and so the question becomes, when people have relied on these title grants, in good faith, right? Folks didn't go in thinking, haha, this is an opportunity for me to steal some land. They said, well, the Indonesians are here now, so I guess they're the ones issuing land titles. Um, how do we adjudicate among these claims, right? Adverse possession being one of the ways in which we can adjudicate among them, and self-help being another, right? Monique pointed out that, in Trinidad, it really doesn't matter what the courts say. If you think this is your land, you're going to do what you think is necessary. That's a pretty troubling um, comment, but there's certainly communities where I come from that have very similar attitudes, right? So I don't uh, the that's not a judgment against Trinidad and Tobago or Trinidadians or Monic at all. It's just
So I know. You don't need to explain it.
so. Anyway, yeah, I think that this is, the violence that is the concern here is the violence that erupts when multiple people think that their claim to the land is the superior claim. And if there is no mechanism for adjudicating those claims, then violence is very likely, right? Because what else do we have to resort to? So I don't know. What criticisms do you have of adverse possession? Right, and so Monic pointed out earlier that you're not solving all of the potential for violence over property, right? There is room for violence to continue. Okay, so I want to sort of peg that, make a point that you guys already have started criticizing the doctrine. What other criticisms do we have?
Well, Catherine was saying that in the article, she said that critics say that adverse possession would unduly burden landowners because owners may not always be aware that the land is being adversely possessed and may not want to engage in hostile litigation over that particular piece of land. So she was also saying that possession may have been lost due to no fault of the owner, which would be unfair.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the court's response to that is, tough. I think the court's response is, if you have rights, we expect you to exercise them. We expect you to take action to protect your own rights. But you're right that there's a fairness issue there that, is there a if the title owner doesn't have the resources, however you define it, to seek a legal resolution, then then is it fair to dispossess them, to make the poor poorer because they're poor, right? Does that seem fair? Maybe not. Okay. Let me think. What about, like, there's a particular problem in the case of Timor-Leste that I think is useful for us to talk about, because I think that it is a problem that historically has not been present in common law jurisdictions like the Caribbean, but we may start seeing it. And that's the problem of, can a doctrine that provides for an adjudicative process prevent violence if the adjudicators are not respected or legitimized? So one of the things that Ms. Williams talks about in her article is that Timor-Leste has a severe lack of institutional capacity in its judiciary. And do we think that that lack of institutional capacity means that even if they implemented adverse possession as a system, that they simply could not have that it wouldn't solve any of the problems. Right? Do you think that people would be more likely to go to law if the law gave them this path to a solution, or do you think they'd just ignore the legal solution because they don't trust it?
So could you repeat, like, if who would go to law?
Um, I think she was saying that adverse possession would give the judges the ability to have clearer judgments. I think so. That in that respect might give the persons confidence in the judiciary in that aspect. Therefore, they would listen to them. On the other hand, where the judges failed, I think she mentioned that they failed most of the judging courses and all of that, and they weren't necessarily good judges per se.
Yeah.
May not be persuasive to the persons in Timor-Leste per se.
Yeah, and I think that's a really helpful point to keep in mind, is that judicial legitimacy is a feedback loop, right? In that you get your legitimacy from offering judgments that provide sort of clear and understandable rationales, and you get the clear and understandable rationales uh, from legal doctrine that you can apply, that comes from being legitimate, and so it builds on itself, right? It becomes this virtuous cycle. And so I think that's a really important point, and sort of goes to, as you point out, the fact that the lack of institutional capacity is particularly acute in Timor-Leste, right? But let's talk about a situation that's a little closer to home. Okay, so I found out very recently, I'm sure that you guys have known this, that uh, that most of Montserrat is uninhabitable right now. That because of the volcano eruption 25 years ago. And so, at the time of the eruption, right, 2/3 of the island is currently uninhabitable, is currently the exclusion zone. But at the time of the eruption, all of that land was occupied and used and owned, and it's all now just been abandoned. And, you know, I think the statistics I saw said that about 3/4 of the population have fled, mostly to the United Kingdom, but to other places as well. And so, so the question that I have, the question that I think is relevant for today's conversation is, the day is going to come that the experts are going to say that it's safe to go back into the exclusion zone, right? What do we do with all this land that had owners? And how do we determine who owns it now? And what if we can't determine who owns it now? What happens? What should happen? Those are two different questions.
I think it goes directly to the heart of adverse possession, as you were saying. Even though the person might have the title over the property, because of your, I guess, inaction, it will go to somebody else. Like, I had a good example just now. Just laughing.
I know that feeling all too well. Walk into a room and go, "Why did I come in here?"
So,
I think that's how dogs live their lives. So go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
so I guess like in a case of, I guess where the person lives on a property for such and such a time, if the owner realizes and I guess has the title and shows the courts that they have the title within the limitation period, they should be able to get back their property. But if the limitation period passes and the person that is on a property, they should be able to get it adversely because of the situations in in the country itself. Like I'm trying to bring it back to Timor Leste, but I don't know how to necessarily bring it back per se.
If the Timor Leste case is speaking to you, then by all means you can talk about it in that sense as well. So we just because I've sort of given you an illustration here in the Caribbean doesn't mean that you have to like rely on that if that doesn't make sense to you or you can't wrap your head around it sort of out of the blue.
Like in Timor Leste, where the Indonesians, where they had the Indonesian withdrawal, and the families had to move. So where the families had to move, and they were staying there, and they had their families there for how much ever years, it would be unfair for them to move per se. And I guess that would be kind of similar to Montserrat. Like if you stay in the uninhabited area for how much ever years you and your family are there, and then all of a sudden you have to move, it wouldn't necessarily be fair to them per se. But on the other hand, it might not be fair to the person who had the original title. But because of their inaction, it kind of balances it out in a sense.
So I think this is absolutely right, and I think that you've really captured something that I want to remind you of and to encourage you to think about, which is that policy making requires trade-offs, right? There are always costs imposed with any sort of policy choice, and part of being an effective policymaker is asking who are the costs being imposed on and what are the costs and is it fair to impose these costs on these people. And I think that in law in particular, we have a tendency to forget that the world doesn't have to be the way that it is, right? So when we make a decision in law, whatever it is, the decision is framed in such a way as to suggest that this is the only possible outcome, right? No other outcome makes sense. No other outcome is allowed. But that's also completely inconsistent with how we engage in decision making in the law to begin with, right? Adversarialness, right, is itself predicated on the notion that there are alternatives, that there's more than one possible outcome. And so I think we do you guys a disservice, and I include myself in that, right? When we say there is one answer here. Because then you stop asking, well, what alternatives are there? And that's been the point of this tutorial and of a lot of the things that we've done in this semester, is that I want you guys to be asking the question, what alternatives are there? Are they good? Are they bad? Do they work for what we want to accomplish. You know, these are all questions that don't necessarily have right answers. They just have the answers that are right for you. So I don't know that this is super helpful. I feel like I'm sort of rambling at you guys, but what questions do you have?
So my question wasn't on adverse possession. I just couldn't remember. Like, so if you have, um, let me guess this. I wrote it up. If you have fee simple determinable and somebody else has the possibility of revertal, do yours still have equal shares, or like each person equally have the same amount of shares or not?
So the answer to that is that the possessory interest and the future interest are divided separately. So there's no overlap in terms of, like, you don't add together your possession, but there is merger, so that if you own both the possessory and the future interest, if you own a one piece of the possessory interest and you own a different sized piece of the future interest, then to the extent that they overlap, that share merges and creates a larger possessory interest.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
yeah. Okay. What other questions? No other questions? Everything's clear and makes sense? Sure.
Sir, in terms of adverse possession, is there exemption to certain time periods? Because I think in tort they have like you could be exempted from the statute of limitations if X, Y, and Z. So is there necessarily an
So
exemption?
you're talking about tolling in the statute of limitations, and the answer is that any tolling doctrine that would apply in, if this were a tort case, would probably apply in adverse possession, and might serve to break the continuous element. So I guess what I would say is, it seems to me that it might be possible, and I'm spitballing as I say this, so I feel free to not rely on this. It seems like it might be possible that the statute of limitations has run, and so the title owner um, can't bring an action for ejectment, but because of some tolling, the adverse possession period has not run. I don't know that this makes any sense. Forget I said anything. I'm not sure that I can explain it, and to be perfectly honest, it is not something that you need to know for this class. So anyway, I'm sorry, Christopher. You said yes, please, and I don't know what you said yes, please in response to.
Sir, would you say that adverse possession is not really applicable to modern society, or is it like an outdated doctrine?
I mean, I think Charlotte Williams would say no, right? I think that Ms. Williams would absolutely take the position that um, that adverse possession has its place in a modern property system. Um, I think that she does offer some commentary that suggests that if you have a Torrens style title registration system, that perhaps adverse possession is a little less salient once the land registry is sort of up and running, right?
Yes, but
Uh,
she's saying if you don't have a good judiciary, if you don't have land registry at organized, if you don't have the property at organized properly, if the legislator is incompetent, X, Y, Z. So I was saying if you have all of these things in check, does adverse possession really would have been needed in Timor Leste per se?
well, I guess a better question would be like, do you need adverse possession in, say, Canada? Um, you know, or uh, Jamaica, right? Places that have a well-respected judiciary, um, you know, well-established land registries, that sort of thing. So does that seem like a place where adverse possession still has a role to play? And um, empirically, right, the answer is yes, right? We can absolutely see that adverse possession is still part of the law in all of these places. Um, but there are jurisdictions that have abolished it, right? Or that have severely limited its applicability. And certainly um, civil law jurisdictions in Europe uh, don't have this sort of doctrine. Um, so I think that, I think the answer to your question, so to the extent that you are asking for like um, what's the right answer, that's a question that I think there are that I think is very context specific and also differs from person to person. If you're asking me sort of what my opinion is, I think that uh, adverse possession plays a role in the modern system in that um, it forces property owners to engage with their assets. And that's a good thing, right? Even if all you're doing is just sort of driving past it and making sure that it's in the same condition that you left it in a year ago, um, that's a positive thing that we should be encouraging. Is my opinion. So,
Okay. I understand that, sir, and that makes sense. But say there's legislation saying that if you don't take care of your property, well, then there's a fine or prison time. Wouldn't that do the same thing as the adverse possession?
I mean, maybe if you do that, then that creates, I mean, I guess that sort of, I think you're right. The This is another example, I think, of policymaking trade-offs, right? Because um, if you have an adverse possession system, then the incentives that you're looking to create, the behavior that you're looking to create, arises out of sort of natural incentives of I want to protect my assets and whatnot. If you want to induce the behavior through a regulatory statute, then that requires you to build out an enforcement mechanism. You have to create an administrative agency, and you have to have inspectors that go around, and you have to create standards for, this is what's required for you to maintain your property, and fundamentally, I think legislators are usually pretty lazy. And I think I think if you give a legislator an option that sort of outsources the cost of policy making while still maintaining the benefits, I think a lot of legislators would go for that. I don't know, maybe maybe I'm blinded by my own experiences in the very bizarre American political spectrum, right? But yeah, the answer to your question is I think you absolutely could do it that way. I think that imposes costs that may not be worth the benefits that you get out of it. So, okay. What other questions? Last chance for questions. Okay, nothing else. All right. Well, then I'm gonna call it a day here, and I will see you guys tomorrow. So take care and bye.